everybody. Thank you for joining me for Conversations on Character, Community, and Crisis. This series is part of the Virtues and Vocations initiative at Duke University, seeking to make character, purpose, and meaning central to education and pre-professional and professional education in particular. My name is Suzanne Shanahan, and I direct the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke, the institutional home for this initiative and series. A brief note on the logistics for today's conversation. Backstage, there are lots of folks who will swiftly address any technical difficulties we might have. Fortunately, the hurricane that beset us yesterday has moved up the East Coast, so we're hoping not to have a power outage as we did yesterday. Also, please note that we're going to talk for about 40 minutes and then we'll transition to questions. Folks backstage are organizing your questions and they'll forward them on to me so I can discuss them with today's conversation partner. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce Emily Esfahani Smith on social upheaval and the search for meaning and purpose. Emily is a writer living in Washington, D.C. In her writing, she draws on psychology, philosophy, and literature to write about the human experience, why we are the way we are, and how we can find grace and meaning in a world full of suffering. Her book, The Power of Meaning, is an international bestseller, already translated into 16 different languages. Emily is the former managing editor of The New Criterion. Her articles have appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and The Atlantic, as well as other publications. She studied philosophy at Dartmouth College. She has an MA in positive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. And in just a few weeks, we'll be starting a PhD in clinical psychology at Catholic University. Welcome, Emily. So great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Let me just have a brief note about the flow of our conversation. So a book titled The Power of Meaning is certainly on lots of people's COVID must-read lists. So I think the first thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about your argument, how you came to the ideas, and kind of push and prod. And in particular, because our interest is really in these notions of vocation and character, to try to link up notions of purpose to vocation and character a little bit. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about how your ideas might be changing with COVID, how they might be developing, where you might be taking them. See if you have any advice for us. I'm a parent of many, many teenagers. And so questions of happiness, purpose, and meaning have been fraught all summer, mostly because we've been talking about unhappiness, purposelessness, and meaninglessness. So advice to parents, advice to all of us in thinking about this moment. And then finally, I just want to play with the ideas a little bit and see if we can push them in some new directions. So that's the basic rundown. Seem fair?
That sounds great.
Okay, good. So let's just start with the basic argument in your book. And if you can flesh it out a little bit for us, as you know, lots of people are feeling pretty empty, alone, sad at this moment. And so how should we be thinking about this? And what is your argument about finding meaning?
So I came to this topic of meaning. I mean, in a sense, it's always been something that's been important to me because of my childhood experiences, which we can talk about later if you think that's relevant. But I really kind of started digging into it in a serious way when I was receiving my master's in positive psychology. And there I encountered the work of Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor, who wrote this beautiful small book called Man's Search for Meaning. And the book is about his time in the concentration camps and what he learned there. And what was really striking to me about what he wrote is that even in the midst of the most horrendous type of circumstance one can imagine, Frankl was arguing that there is still this form of well-being and hope available to all of us. And he calls it tragic optimism, which is the ability to find meaning and to see some light, even in the most horrible circumstances. And he found, based on his observations in the camps, that those who had this ability to find meaning, even in these horrendous circumstances, were more resilient to their suffering and even more apt to survive, he says. And actually, this is a point that has now been borne out by modern empirical research, that when they have a sense of meaning and purpose, they do experience greater longevity. So there was this idea that my mind was playing with. And then I was in this culture that we're all a part of here in the United States, where there was kind of this different message about well-being that was being promoted, and that I was kind of receiving, and I think a lot of people receive, which is that the good life is a happy life, and that we should pursue happiness, and that if we pursue happiness, we'll be better liked and more successful and be considered more attractive, all these benefits from pursuing happiness, this kind of positive emotional and mental state. And those two things didn't quite jive to me, because really what Frankl was saying, and the kind of signature idea that he promoted both before, during, and after his experience in the camps, was this thing called logotherapy. Logos is the ancient Greek word for meaning, meaning therapy. And the idea is that we have this need for meaning that's as important for our psychological and spiritual and emotional well-being as the need for food, water, shelter are for our physical well-being. And that this is really what should be driving our pursuits in life, and not so much this pursuit of happiness. And so that's really what began me on this journey to write this book, where I basically argue in the first part of the book that there's more to life than being happy, and that so much of the suffering that we see in this world, the message that we receive suggests that happiness is what can ease that suffering and fill that hole within. But really what the research suggests, what the ideas of people like Frankl and many others suggest, is that it's really the search for meaning and possessing meaning that fills that hole and satisfies that suffering.
And so how old were you when you first happened on to Frankl? And was this at the time an aha moment, or is it something you came back to as other things came to you?
I think I must have been about 25 years old. So I was a few years out of college, and I mentioned kind of my childhood. Now, maybe this is a good time to talk a little bit more about that. So it was a bit of an aha moment, because I felt myself through high school and college, in those first few years out of college, when you're really trying to come of age, form an identity, find your place in the world, surrounded by this message that what you should be doing as you do all those things and find your path is pursuing happiness, pursuing success, all these kinds of, splashy type versions of well-being that the culture sells us. And when I encountered Frankl's work, when I was in my, mid-20s, let's say, it was a hearkening back to some ideas that I learned in my childhood, where a very different image of a good life was presented to me and lived by those who I was surrounded by. So I grew up in Montreal, downtown Montreal, and my parents administered from our home a Sufi meeting house. And Sufism is a mystical spiritual practice that's associated with Islam. So for those who might not know, the poet Rumi was a Sufi, the whirling dervishes are Sufis. Those are some popular touch points. And living in the meeting house was kind of like what I imagine, living in a Buddhist Sangha would be. Twice a week, Sufis, these spiritual seekers, would come to our home. They would sit on the ground for several hours and meditate. And they, they like so many of the religious and spiritual systems of the world, the point of their practice was to kind of turn down the volume on the small self, the false self, the ego within each of us, so that the kind of higher self, our true nature, could emerge and connect with this even larger reality, which they thought of as God, others think of as universal consciousness, nature, whatever, this kind of just this higher sacred thing. And so, and many of these Sufis, by the way, had led really hard lives. Some of them were refugees from the Middle East or North Africa, where you can be put to death in places like Saudi Arabia for being a Sufi. It's considered heretical. In Iran, where my family's from, Sufi meeting houses, like the one that I grew up in, they're bombed by the regime. They're destroyed. So we had people like that coming through our door, and we also had kind of Westerners, Canadians, and Americans who had been beaten up by life in other ways, and so they'd led these kind of hard lives, and yet they found satisfaction and comfort and peace in this spiritual practice that called on them to reduce the voice of their ego, to practice loving kindness, to have an attitude of service towards the world. And so when I read Frankl, and I thought, oh, like that is what it's really about. That's why these messages about happiness aren't resonating with me, is because I kind of grew up with a different perspective on what a good life constitutes. And coming to Frankl was a bit of an aha moment, but also kind of a homecoming.
Okay, so one of the things I find interesting is in a recent piece you talked about Frankl and said that happiness must ensue. So is your narrative without an element of happiness, or does happiness factor in some way? And I ask really in a sort of personal sense, because I consider myself an incredibly happy person. And there are moments of extraordinary joy throughout my day that I just take delight in. And so it's not that I don't feel I don't have meaning, but I also feel really happy. So where does happiness, does it ever fold back in, or are you kind of bracketing happiness because you don't want that to be the ultimate goal?
No, absolutely. That's such a great question. And I said kind of earlier that happiness is this, positive mental and emotional state. And it's kind of, there's a lot of different ways to experience happiness. There's joy, like you say, there's pleasure, there's, some people think of happiness as contentedness or peacefulness. And I think those are all really wonderful states. What I think is the problem is what you were getting at towards the end there, which is that when you make the pursuit of happiness, this single-minded pursuit, that's what causes problems. And the research shows that when people kind of pursue happiness and chase it with the passion and the avidness that our culture encourages us to do, they actually end up feeling less happy. And actually, even more than that, when researchers try to look at what is driving, this decades-long rise in depression and anxiety and loneliness and suicide even, which, it had been rising for decades, but then during the pandemic, it kind of just shot way upward because of the circumstances we all find ourselves in. When they look at what's driving all this misery, what they find specifically is that it's not a lack of happiness in people's lives, but a lack of meaning. And so what Frankl was arguing, and what the subsequent research on meaning and happiness shows, is that you can have both, but that happiness comes from these things that we do and pursue because they're meaningful, whether it's the work that we do or, paid and unpaid, like raising children, or, writing for me, teaching, I imagine for you, that these things, that these projects and pursuits that are meaningful, when we pursue them, they don't necessarily always make us happy in the moment, because it can be hard and stressful. It requires sacrifice. But that in the end, there's this kind of long-term version of happiness, kind of an authentic, deeper form of happiness that comes with it.
So we have something called, in our household, called Fruit Loop happiness. And so this is something when my children were very small, now teenagers, on Mondays, they could eat whatever cereal they wanted for breakfast, and decided at the supermarket they would pick the one that had least nutritional value. And we have consumed it on Monday mornings for 2 decades now. And that for them in this COVID moment, they are identifying what they call Fruit Loop happinesses. And these are small moments of connectedness, but also small moments that are utterly trivial and unconnected to a larger purpose, right? So Fruit Loops for us is something that brings us together. And so there's a relationship there. But for each of them, they're silly little things, like they won a tennis match, right? The dog learned a new trick. They're not connected, and they're really disembodied from any broader sense of themselves or sense of meaning. How do those connect up? Are those just distractions from their sense of meaninglessness in some way? Or how do we think about those?
Yeah, first of all, I love that concept of Fruit Loop happiness, and it makes me want to have a bowl of Fruit Loops right now, which I don't think I've had in many years. But I actually think that, I mean, so going back to this idea of having happiness and meaning, I remember coming across a data set that looked at, asked people, it was thousands of people, do you have meaning in your life? Do you feel happy? And it broke down basically, roughly speaking into quarters, where a quarter of people had both happiness and meaning, a quarter had happiness, no meaning, I mean, not no meaning, but less meaning. A quarter had high meaning, low happiness, and a quarter was low on both. So I can imagine, some people pursuing Fruit Loop happiness and that's it, and being in that quadrant where they don't have a sense of meaning. But I can also imagine having Fruit Loop happiness and being in that quadrant where you do have a sense of meaning, and where indeed those moments of happiness can bolster and support a sense of meaning. One of the studies that I wrote about in that piece that you mentioned about Frankl and tragic optimism, which is about, the piece is basically about, how can we shore up our mental health during the pandemic. One of the studies looked at people in the wake of the September 11th terrorist attacks. And they, actually it was, I think, a group of students in North Carolina at UNC. The researchers happened to have data on the students before the attacks, like their levels of happiness and resilience and things like that. And then the attacks happened, and the researchers followed up with them, several weeks later to see how they were doing. And so they had, the pre-attack well-being and the post-attack well-being that they could look at. And what they found was that everyone after the attacks kind of experienced everything you would expect them to. It was distressing. They felt scared, anxious. It was a blow to their sense of how the world works, all of those negative things. But some people were more resilient. So some people kind of, that negativity caused them to descend into depressive state. And for others, they didn't get into that depressive state. They kind of had the negativity, but were able to move forward in a healthy way. And what they found is that the ones who were more resilient, who didn't descend into depression, they had more positive experiences. They looked to their positive emotions more to kind of buttress them. And it's not clear whether they actually sought out those experiences as a coping mechanism, or they had as many as the other group, but just noticed them more. So in either case, though, there was something about this kind of positive mindset that was protective for them, a protective factor. And to me, what this concept goes back to is the idea of hope and of tragic optimism, that even when things are really hard and bad, that there are these little glimmers of light that you can find and hold on to, whether it's that sense of enjoyment from, eating something that brings you pleasure, or the connection that it fosters between two people, or something, bigger than that.
Great. You talk about 4 pillars of meaning. Can you run through those with us? And then maybe we can talk a little bit about how they relate together and where you see the most important pillar, things like that.
Yes, of course. So, so after I, had this moment with Frankl and kind of was building this argument about happiness and meaning, I began to wonder, okay, if meaning is so important and it's important for us to have meaning in our lives, what do we need to have in our lives for them to feel meaningful? Does everyone have to discover that on their own? Or are there certain kind of principles that can guide all of us? And that question led me on this search where I interviewed many, many people about their own journeys. I looked to the research in psychology, but also sociology, neuroscience. I looked back to ancient ideas in philosophy and religion. And I started, gathering all of this data that I had accumulated and trying to figure out what it was that I was finding. And as I looked at it, there were these 4 themes, these pillars, as I call them, that came up again and again in the stories people told me and in the research that I was, paging through. And these 4 pillars, so basically when you talk to people about what makes their lives meaningful, or when you look at what the research and ancient ideas say about meaning in life, people talk about having relationships that give them a strong sense of belonging. So belonging is the first pillar. They talk about having a purpose or some reason to get up in the morning that's meaningful to them. And that usually involves or always involves making some sort of contribution to the world. They talk about moments of transcendence. So transcendence as one of the pillars, where you feel lifted above the hustle and bustle of daily life and come into contact with something much bigger, cosmic and sacred almost. These can be experiences in nature, religion, things like that, experiences of self-loss. And then finally, they have a narrative, a story that they tell about the person they are, how they got to be that way, and where they're going. So storytelling is the 4th pillar. So belonging, purpose, transcendence, and storytelling.
Great. Can you have meaning if one of those is missing?
So one of the things that I did, and the short answer to that question is yes. For some people, transcendence it just isn't very important. Maybe they don't have that particular receptor in their soul or their spirit for that. And so, but belonging is very important to them. And if they don't have those relationships for belonging, they feel an emptiness that they wouldn't feel if they didn't have transcendence. So I created this quiz on my website where you can answer some questions, and it'll tell you, you're more of a belonging person or transcendence person. With that said, I do think that, especially as we think about this moment right now and what we need, the kind of psychological resources we need to get through this storm, what the research does seem to suggest is that the more sources of meaning you have, the more of these pillars that you have, and the stronger that they are, the more you're able to weather the storm or whatever earthquake comes your way. So having, 3 or 4 of the pillars in your life is probably better than having just one, that kind of thing.
One of the things I really appreciate about your argument is when you talk about purpose, right? And for you, purpose doesn't have to be something enormous and grand, but it can be prosaic. It can be part of everyday life. Are there boundaries to purpose? Can certain things not be purpose?
That's an interesting question, because I tend to think of purpose almost more as a mindset. So you live with purpose. It's not like, you have to go and turn over all these rocks to find your capital P purpose. But that if you have a purpose mindset, that you can feel purpose in whatever you do, which is to say that you can see how the things that you do have intrinsic meaning and make some kind of contribution to the world. So, you mentioned that you have, your children at home. And for so many parents who I spoke to, they said, raising my kids is a form of purpose. And there are all kinds of prosaic things that go with that, whether it's dropping them off at sports practice or making them breakfast in the morning, even disciplining them. But if you kind of think about all of those smaller things in the service of this larger purpose of, raising children, loving children, things like that, then each of those things kind of becomes ennobled in a way that it wasn't before if you maybe didn't have that mindset. I spoke to a hospital cleaner who was part of this bigger study on meaning at work. And now you talking about, a kind of professional example, she said that, my purpose is healing sick people. So what did she do every day? She kind of, swept the floors, mopped, cleaned out trash bins and bedpans, but she didn't say that, I'm just doing this job, of these particular tasks to earn a living. She said, my purpose is this bigger kind of transcendent thing. So are there things that don't have purpose? I mean, the thing that immediately comes to mind for me is with children, especially, the idea of unstructured play. So when you let kids kind of play and explore, it's really for the enjoyment of the act itself. And adults can play as well. It just takes on a different form, like, reading or traveling, or just being kind of immersed in something for the fun and pleasure of it. I guess those might be things that are activities in and of themselves that aren't kind of directed towards some other goal.
So just thinking this through a little bit, right? So you talk about a purpose mindset. And so part of that is, right, it sounds like it connects a little bit to the storytelling argument. So it's, what's the narrative you tell yourself about how these connect, and almost asking toward what end, and what's the bigger picture? And right, you use the word ennobling the activities and kind of aggregating them into a bigger whole. Is it harder to do that, right? So last week we had a conversation with Nancy Kane, who's written the book Forged in Crisis. And she has these exemplars, Abraham Lincoln, Shackleton, and they're individuals who have, right, forged leadership in extraordinary circumstances, had profound sense of purpose. Is partly what you're saying that we don't need that profound mountain to climb, but that the kind of daily, almost banal things can be noble and purposeful with the right mindset?
That's exactly it. I think I think there is this kind of myth about meaning in our culture, especially around this pillar of purpose, which we hear about so much. It's almost become a cliched term that's lost its meaning, unfortunately, where, the rhetoric is like, yeah, you have to find your purpose. It has to be this big thing. And then you have to kind of like, post pictures on Instagram of, yourself pursuing it. And I think for some people that might be the journey. Somebody might be in college and say, my purpose is finding a cure for cancer. I'm going to go to medical school, become a researcher, a doctor, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that can be part of one's purpose mindset, while at the same time seeing purpose in these smaller daily things. And I think that, again, it protects us in a way when we think about purpose in this way, because if you do have some grand purpose and it is kind of tied to career goals, or, these endeavors that lie outside of yourself, you can't always control what happens. Maybe you die not having found the cure to cancer. Especially when you're young, people have these very grand ideas about how they want their lives to unfold. But so if those things don't come to pass, then it's not like you're stuck without, rudderless, without purpose, because if you have this mindset of purpose, you can find it in other ways. You can see how your relationships can be a form of purpose, how these different roles you play in life. And to your point about storytelling, that this is where we kind of see the pillars blending into one another, because, a relationship can be a source of belonging, but it can also be a purposeful identity, like being a parent, for example, to go back to what I was saying before.
Again, just thinking, right, of young people, right, students going into college, or my high school students. So one of my daughters has spent the summer perfecting things like the best refrigerator organization. Mm-hmm. And she's created little videos largely for family members, how to fold or perfectly fold a towel. And the joke in our house is that, right, if she is, right, she's doing these things in an absence of purpose. It's partly what you're saying, that, right, that she can actually craft this as purpose, right? She's doing it for others. Right, she has a broader mission of, organizing the family household, and that's sufficient. Mm-hmm. She doesn't need to be working at a soup kitchen. She doesn't need to be committing her life to the pursuit of, eradicating cancer or something else. That she can have purpose and meaning in towel folding.
No, absolutely. I mean, I said a second ago, maybe there are these kinds of intrinsic activities that we do that don't have purpose. But as I think about it, I really think that, you can bring a purpose mindset to anything, because, purpose is really about what we do day to day. And there's so many things that we do. And each of those can be purposeful. And the story of your daughter actually reminds me of one of my favorite studies that I came across in this research about children doing chores. And what the researchers found is that when kids did chores around the house, whether it was kind of cleaning up or watching their siblings, doing the dishes, that they actually felt a stronger sense of purpose. And, I don't think it was necessarily conscious to these kids that, I'm doing this and it's purposeful. I think that there was this kind of, pervading sense, though, that what they were doing was contributing to the creation of a home, to their parents, to their families, like your daughter's videos are.
Great. How does meaning connect to issues of character or virtue? You talked earlier about hope. Are there particular character traits that are important to this mindset? Are there affective ways of being that one can cultivate?
That's so interesting. So I think there's like a few different ways to kind of get into that topic. One of them is, researchers, one of the kind of grand projects of positive psychology, which is what I got my master's in, the study of well-being, was trying to create a manual of character strengths and virtues to kind of counter the manual of disorders. That's the DSM, which, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Disorders. And so what they did is they went out and they looked at, cultures through time and across the world, different religions, philosophies, et cetera, to figure out, what are the character strengths that come up again and again, or virtues. They use those terms interchangeably. And there were 24. And if my memory serves me correctly, some of those were more associated with living a meaningful life. In particular, the virtue of hope, which you mentioned, and some of the other kind of spiritual virtues like love. I think spirituality itself might have been a virtue. So these things that kind of take us outside of ourselves. And I probably should have said this earlier, but meaning is defined by connecting and contributing to something beyond yourself, and that can be your family, your work, religious pursuits, those kinds of things. So that's one way into it, just kind of the empirical research showing that, some virtues do indeed associate more with leading a meaningful life. And along this point too, one of the studies that I write about in my book shows that the particular kind of story that you tell about your life, if you tell a redemptive story, a story where bad things are redeemed by good things, that, for example, like this really, hard summer for your daughter, let's say, was redeemed by the fact that she was creating these videos and they were helpful to others. People who tell those kinds of stories are more generative, what psychologists call generative, which means they're more likely to care about kind of giving back to others, in particular younger generations, kind of bringing them up. So that's another virtue angle. The other way is kind of, so I think that's more bottom up. The other way is more top down, where you have philosophers like Aristotle or, different kind of religious practices that say, if you lead a life of virtue, that is kind of synonymous with leading a meaningful life, that when you pursue the virtues, are kind of, a good person and do good in the world, that meaning comes from that. And we, again, there's research that kind of backs this up, that shows that when people do things like, visiting loved ones in the hospital, or when they, focus on doing their homework, the pursuit of excellence as a virtue, that indeed brings people a deeper sense of meaning in life. Great.
Is meaning something that you can have more or less of, and are there implications of that? So is there, and again, I'm thinking of your most recent piece and the conversation about tragic optimism, this notion that you need to have a reason to be happy, or happiness will ensue. Right, is a little meaning as good as a lot of meaning in terms of your well-being, your resilience, or is more better? And right, can you get more over time? Is it cumulative?
That's such an interesting question. So one of the first things that comes to mind for me is this paper that's fairly well known within positive psychology. I can't remember what it's called, but I think the researchers were Adam Grant and Barry Schwartz, two people with really wonderful bodies of research, and they find that like more is not always better. The happier, if you're like extremely happy, that comes with a lot of problems and neuroses. Even bipolar disorder, for example, is characterized by, on the one end, extreme happiness and mania. And they talk about Aristotle's idea of the golden mean. Going back to the idea of virtue. Too much virtue or too little virtue are vices. So, the virtue is courage. Too little of it is cowardice. Too much of it is recklessness. So there's this kind of golden mean. I don't remember, I don't think that they spoke about meaning in that particular paper, but I think that probably we can say, we can draw similar conclusions that if you have too much meaning, you might become like a fanatic, like people in ISIS and members of cults. Like they're part of those organizations because those things bring meaning to them. I think a lot of people who who believe that there is some cause that they have to devote themselves to and it's so meaningful are more likely to resort to kind of violent means to accomplish those goals. And I think that's a problem. Too little meaning, we've talked a little bit about that and the kind of emptiness that it can breed. So I think that meaning, there is a kind of golden mean to it. And maybe, what tempers it are the virtues, so that if you do have a sense of hope or what Aristotle called practical wisdom, you're not going to go, towards the extremes.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about COVID. And is your thinking at all changed in terms of your argument based on your own experience or what you've been hearing for others? Or do you feel it's more reinforced what you thought before? Are you editing the vision at all?
I think that it's a real test of the arguments that I'm trying to make, because so many people have not only are these everyday sources of happiness that were part of our lives before, especially in the summer with vacation and the simple pleasures of life, being outside by the beach, ice cream, whatever. Not only are those less or no longer part of our lives, but a lot of people have had their sources of meaning taken away too, whether they've been laid off. A lot of college seniors who graduated into a job market that was very different from what they were expecting, not being able to see family and friends as much. So there is this kind of vacuum of both happiness and meaning. And as I, kind of look around and talk to people and experience my own life, I think what I'm learning and realizing is how much, meaning can be something that's constructed. I think, if you asked me a year ago, I would have talked maybe a little bit more about how there's meaning all around us and we can find it if we kind of open our eyes to it. I think that's still true. I think the example of your daughter with the videos is true. Is an example of that. And I think, going on these daily walks that a lot of people are taking, these COVID walks and being in nature, is another example of kind of the meaning that's all around us that we can kind of low-hanging fruit that we can pick off. But I think that, in these challenging circumstances, we can also more proactively construct meaning for ourselves. I'll give an example just of myself, not because, to talk about myself, but just because it's, it's one way that I've done it. As I mentioned, I grew up in this, Sufi meeting house, and I come from a Persian background, and a big part of my childhood, involved Persian food. My grandmother lived with us half the year and she would always cook, my mom as well. And for me, that's a real comfort, and that means home. But I never, and I want that comfort now, especially because I haven't seen my family in a really long time, my aunts and my grandmother. And so one way that I've been trying to reconnect with that part of myself is learning how to cook those meals, so that I can do it for my kids one day, if I, God willing. So that's kind of one way that I've been able to construct meaning. And I think you see a lot of people doing this with all the bread baking that was going on earlier. maybe still going on, and these personal projects people are taking on to find meaning.
Do you think, what relationship does routine have to finding and maintaining meaning?
Mm-hmm. There's actually a study that shows that, having habits and having routine does contribute to a sense of meaning. And I think, one of the things that researchers find with people who have a strong sense of meaning is that they believe life and the world and their own sense of identity is coherent. So coherence as this aspect of meaningfulness. And in my model, I talk about that in terms of storytelling. But I think if you kind of take it, make it a little bit more broad, coherence has to do with, having order in our lives instead of feeling like life is chaos and senseless, having order and bringing sense to our day-to-day lives. And I think habits and routine are one way that we do that.
What kind of advice would you have for universities who are accepting back students who are going to be struggling with these issues? How do we work with students to cultivate a sense of meaning in this strange time, and likely in virtual ways?
Mm-hmm. I think that, a first step is just acknowledging that this is something that people are struggling with, because sometimes what's more painful than even the struggle is being with people who don't acknowledge it. It's this kind of elephant in the room and no one's talking about it. So I think acknowledging it and creating space for the students to talk about it as appropriate, in the classroom. It may be that some classes, it's not appropriate to talk about it, but I have to think that in many classes, especially in the humanities and social sciences, there is some space to talk about it. And, I would really urge teachers, professors, administrators to do this, because it for, decades, going back to the beginning of our country's founding, the idea of the university, it was always thought that one of the purposes of the university was to help young people discover how to lead a meaningful life. And the idea was that, you teach them all these things, and as you're teaching them, the education brings up all these questions that implicate issues of meaning, like, what kind of life do I want to lead? What kind of person am I? What is the good that I should aspire to? And so for decades, that was always at the center of the university, and only recently has it been kind of pushed aside as professionalism and other kinds of goals took priority. So I think returning to that mission of the university too, this is almost a moment where universities can do that, and doing so would be in the service of their students.
Great. Well, the questions are queuing up, so I didn't get to section 3, but before we pivot to audience questions, what are you most hopeful about?
I am hopeful about, that even as, as there's so much kind of chaos and uncertainty and just tragedy and suffering going on all around us, that people, that there is so much good to be found still. I noticed that, when I'm outside, I live in Washington, D.C., a city. Before, when you go on walks, people would kind of just ignore each other, look past one another. But now I think part of it is with the masks, you can't really see people's faces. People actually wave to one another, acknowledge one another, these small things. Also, I'm hopeful about how this moment, I think, has for a lot of people been a crucible where they are reevaluating what is important to them, what is more meaningful, so that they can kind of, once we emerge into a state of more normalness, they can reorient their lives to pursue that meaning. Wonderful.
Okay, so let's turn to some of the questions. There's a question following up on the discussion of fanatics, so extreme meaningfulness. Is there a moral dimension to purpose? Can some pursuits which we may give a person meaning actually be at the expense of others and their meaning and value? Can we say that individual purpose is not always good?
So yeah, I think absolutely. In psychology, because it's a social science, the researchers don't like to kind of get into topics of morality, and they'll say that the purpose someone like Osama bin Laden has just as much purpose as someone like, Mother Teresa, let's say. And that answer is not very satisfying to me. And I do think that purpose, and I think that this is where I bring kind of some of the philosophy in and some of the kind of religious and spiritual teachings. It really does need to be bound by some sort of moral framework in order to truly be doing good in the world. I mean, someone like Hitler thought that he was, that he was kind of bringing good into the world. Obviously that's a moral matrix that was really flawed. So I think that, acknowledging that there are, certain moral values that we don't want to compromise, and that there are moral values, period, and that purpose has to exist within that framework.
Great. You talk about how pursuing happiness instead of searching for meaning actually drives misery. Mm-hmm. What do you think about the contemporary popular notion of self-care? Does this count as pursuing happiness in the negative sense that you've been talking about, or is it really something different?
Mm-hmm. I think the answer is probably a little bit of both. So I think it's really easy to kind of make fun of the self-care movement. And, I remember reading something in McSweeney's, the title was something like, this is how I'm optimizing my life so I can help you optimize yours. And it was this kind of parody of somebody waking up at 3 a.m., having their green smoothie, gratitude journaling, etc. So I think that, you can probably go too far with it per our discussion of the golden mean. At the same time, there's this idea that comes up in the meaning research of compassion fatigue. So, if you are, if so much of your life is devoted to kind of giving to others, you can get burned out by it. And so I think that, being effective in leading a meaningful life, you don't want to become so burned out that it's not something you even want to do anymore. You have to set limits. And I think self-care is part of that, whether it's exercise or taking breaks, things like that. And those moments, by the way, are different ways, I think, that we can experience meaning. I talked about transcendence. We didn't speak too much about it, but, moments of flow, of stillness and idleness, where we kind of come into the present moment, lose ourselves. Those are portals to meaning too, that we can experience through some self-care activities.
Good. Good. This next one is one of my questions too. So this is thinking about purpose and meaning seems connected to privilege. What about folks who just need to put food on the table to get through the next day with chronic illness? How does meaning relate to basic needs and safety?
That's a really great question as well. And what's really interesting actually is that, I think there is this idea that, you have to satisfy certain needs, like basic needs, food, shelter, safety, before you can move on to higher needs like meaning and love, etc. But when you look across the world at the people who report the strongest sense of meaning in life, it's people who are living in developing countries, or countries where they are not experiencing a lot of privilege at all. Many of the sub-Saharan African nations, people report the highest levels of meaning. Places like Haiti as well. And so the narrative about kind of privilege and meaning, I think, is a complicated one. I'm doing some research right now on a different topic about, how we define our personal success. And one of the interesting findings that I came across is that when you look at people in our own country who maybe not be quote unquote as privileged, people doing kind of blue collar work or things that have low occupational prestige, as the researchers call it, like, being a garbage collector, bartender. I think those two were the rated lowest among the population for occupational prestige, that actually these people do have a strong sense of meaning in life, but it comes from not their career, but other domains of life, like their family or their spiritual life. So I actually think that that Frankl was right, that everyone does need meaning, and that we have this place in us that needs to be satisfied to feel full. And that it's maybe not so much a question of privilege as we might think it is.
Right. Does American individualism work against the idea of meaning being a contribution to something outside yourself?
Yeah, I think that's a great question too. And I write about in one of my chapters about this kind of crisis of meaning and misery, and how it is associated sociologically with the rise of individualism. And there's kind of recent data that points to this, but a more theoretical perspective that I think is really helpful is the work of Emil Durkheim on suicide. And Durkheim, a great sociologist, found that in places where there's more individualism, and specifically, I think he found in Protestant countries where there is more individualism, rates of suicide are higher. And it does have to do with his individualism, because people are less constrained by the community. That also comes with having less meaning, because the norms of community life that, traditionally were, did give an architecture of meaning, people aren't as constrained by them. So they're left out on their own to kind of find meaning. That's the idea. But usually they just experience what he calls anomie, this French word that basically means kind of meandering meaninglessness.
Do you think Americans are likely to define meaning differently than in other countries, given the prevalence of an individualist?
That's a really good question. I mean, I'd want to think about it, but I think that it would make sense to me that in more individualistic cultures, there's a more individualistic sense of what meaning is. And you know what, now that I think about it, I think that, the cultural cues that we get about topics like purpose, especially, it is framed as this very individualistic pursuit. You go out and you find your purpose. And by the way, if you're, dating someone who, lives over here, but your purpose is over there, go pursue your purpose, do your thing, find yourself, all this kind of thing. Whereas in more communitarian societies, meaning is much more tethered to the relationships that we have, the duties that we have to others and to society and to ourselves, rather than what we what we're expected to give to life and what we expect from life. And I think that there's probably, the right way is somewhere in between.
Do you think in your argument that, right, is it too easy for people to do a search and replace on the happiness and insert meaning? So go find your meaning now, and you're not going to be successful, you're not going to be fulfilled, you're not going to be happy without meaning. Is there a way that this can become another happiness to pursue? And are there ways to push against that with this more communitarian ethos?
I think you're absolutely right that there is the danger of that. And I sometimes even notice myself kind of doing it when I'm talking, and I try to catch myself, because I don't want meaning to become just another buzzword, and for it to be, this thing that you think, oh, if I just do these 3 easy steps, then I'll have meaning in my life, when really meaning is this kind of lifelong pursuit. We're constantly creating meaningful lives. Our story is constantly unfolding. And so I do think that we need to kind of be careful that it doesn't become like a plug and play situation. And I think also, to your point about communitarianism, if it's true that meaning, and this is what I'm trying to argue, is more complicated and deeper than the well-being that comes with the pursuit of simple happiness, then part of what makes it more complicated and deeper is are those relationships that kind of bind us and that constrain us. And there's this idea in philosophy that you can only really be free if you do have some constraints that are placed on you. And so I think that meaning kind of is in that lane, or at least I hope that when I'm speaking about it, that it comes across that way.
Right. Can you talk a little bit more about the storytelling pillar and how we cultivate storytelling? And you talked about redemptive narratives. Is a story something we actively create? Or does that happen onto us? Do we find it?
So I think, with storytelling, it's really the story that you're telling yourself, about how you became the person that you are today. And when I talk about this particular pillar, I find that it both resonates with people and also surprises them. And I think the reason why it might surprise them is because we don't always realize that we are in this task of actively constructing our narrative, that we are, let me say that again, that we are constantly constructing a narrative without always actively realizing that we're doing it. It's not like, I was born, then I moved here, then this happened, then that happened, and here I am. We're making narrative choices about what we include in the story and what we leave out of it. And we have to leave a lot out because we just can't include everything. So I think once we realize that we are constructing a narrative, we are the authors of our own stories, then we can begin to reflect on whether we're telling a story that's moving us forward or one that's holding us back. And a lot of people do tell stories that hold them back. And I think, part of what therapy is, part of what, journaling helps us do is to edit our story in a way that is more hopeful, all the while respecting the facts, because, I'm not suggesting that we would whitewash the bad of what happened or that we would, include things that didn't happen into it. But it, given that there's all these things that happen to us and that we don't include everything in the story, are we leaving out important things that would actually help us tell a story that does move us forward with more hope? And the evidence suggests that a lot of us, when we're telling our stories, we do tend to discount the positive. When bad things happen, they affect us much more profoundly. They, make kind of deeper indentations in our brain waves even, certainly in our emotional lives, than when good things happen. To the extent that the researchers find that in relationships, you have to have 5 good things happen for every 1 bad one if you want to have a happy relationship, because the bad so poisons the well. So when we think about our stories, what that means is that a lot of us are probably including much more of the negative into our stories, and discounting the positive, not kind of weaving in those positive experiences as well. So I would challenge you, if you are, if you do want to work on the story you're telling yourself, asking yourself, what, first of all, for the negative, what evidence do I have that this is really true? And for the positive, what are things that I am not including into my story that really belong here? As I'm, going through this particular moment with COVID, are there things that I've learned about myself? Is there some wisdom and insight that I've developed, some ways that I've grown that should be part of my story? And maybe I'm not thinking about those as much right now, and I should be.
Great, that's really helpful. Last question. Is there value to having a sense of duty if it is not what we feel gives us meaning? So, and more generally, what is the relationship between duty, obligation, and meaning? This person's thinking about issues of injustice and race that have come up this summer and wondering if there is a duty for people to acknowledge injustice and work for the good, even if their meaning is found elsewhere, or will doing something out of duty eventually lead to meaning, right? So dutifully behave, does meaning ensue?
Yeah, so there's different senses in which we can use the term duty, and I think that it sounds like the way that the questioner is using it is the duties that we have to maybe moral causes or to principles that we as a society, I think we can say agree are important. They're part of the story of the founding of our country, in our founding documents, these aspirations of what the kind of society we want to lead. And yes, first of all, the research does show that when people are engaged in these kinds of causes, when they do have a greater sense of duty, that does, indeed correspond with having, believing that your life is more meaningful. But just, to kind of, put some meat on those bones, I think that, when we do act with duty, or we do feel that we have some duty to something higher and then act that duty out, we're living according to principles and values that are important to us. And that's part of what meaning is. One of the definitions of meaning is leading a life of significance and value. And so when we enact those values, that's leading a meaningful life. Great.
And with that, do you have any final thoughts for us? This has just been fabulous, but any final words?
I've really enjoyed this as well. And I think just to go back to storytelling, one of the things that I think about a lot as I'm moving through this moment in history and in my own life is 10, 20 years down the line, even 5 years down the line, when I'm looking back on this time, what is the story that I want to tell about it? Is it a story that I, spent all this free time, not commuting or whatever, watching Netflix? Or is it, the story that I kind of got, more in touch with things that were more important to me? So what is the story that you want to tell about this time when you look back? Asking yourself that might help you kind of, set yourself on a path that might be more meaningful.
Wonderful bit of advice. And so with that, thank you, Emily, and thanks to all of those who joined us. In 2 weeks, we'll have Elwood Robinson for a conversation on HBCUs and cultivating purpose. And I just want to conclude with a special thanks to the Kern Family Foundation. So thank you, Kern, and thank you, Emily.
Thank you so much.